Hi, guys, and welcome back to In His Side podcast. I'm so happy that you guys are joining me for the official launch of episode one. I'm so happy you guys enjoyed episode zero. I was a little nervous to upload it because not a lot of people really know my testimony. Because, like I said in the episode, I think it's one of those stories that I keep to myself. I don't know why. But I'm happy that I shared it, and I'm happy that people could relate to it and learn something from it. And as we dive into episode one, I really just pray that the Holy Spirit lead us in this Bible study, because that is what it is. It's a closer look on Hagar's story and just the lessons in what happened between Hagar, Abraham, and Sarah. It's really just things that we can learn from that entire interaction. So I hope you guys have your notebooks. I hope you guys have a cup of tea or coffee or water, and I hope you are ready for us to jump in and really look at Hagar's story, because she is the inspiration. Her crying out Elroy is the inspiration behind the podcast, the name of the podcast at least. So yeah, let's go in. Let's jump into it. Okay, so today I did not think I'd treat it as a Bible study, but here we are, spirit led. We're going to break down Genesis 16:21 and Genesis 21, verse 8 to 21. And this is literally just Hagar's story. There's so many things we can learn from Hagar's interaction with God, Hagar's interaction with Sarah and Abraham, and just how they kind of interacted with her and her son and just everything. I think it's just, yeah, there's a lot of learnings here, guys. There's a lot of learnings here. So let's get into it. So a little bit of a background on Genesis 16. This is kind of the first time where we get introduced to Hagar. And Genesis 16 literally tells the story of Sarai, which later becomes Sarah. So I will be referring to her as Sarah. And then Abram, which later becomes Abraham, which I will also refer to him as Abraham. And then obviously Hagar, who stays Hagar. And this chapter literally is just, it's a revelation of human impatience, and just how when we are in a waiting period, when we are waiting for God on something, like something that He promised us, we tend to get a little bit of impatient. We get impatient, and in most cases, we try to act on our own strength instead of just waiting on Him, instead of just relying on Him. We decide that we can do it better. And what I love about just Hagar's story in general is that God shows you that no matter what happens, He is a merciful and a graceful God. Like, even though Sarah and Abraham did what they did to Hagar, God still blessed all of them, because there's a lesson in this entire relationship between the three of them. There is such a good lesson in it. And hey, sometimes God uses your life as a lesson for others. I'm just saying. So I'm gonna read verse 1 to 6, and then we'll go through the learnings. But Genesis 16 verse 1 to 2 says, Abraham's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family. And Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Verse 3 verse to 4 says, so Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. 5 to 6. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you. Abram replied to Sarai, here, your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you want with her. Then Sarai mistreated her so much she ran away from her. There's a lot to unpack. Just in verse 1 to 6, there is so much to unpack. So, in verse 1 to 2, we learn about, we've known kind of about Sarah's infertility, right? It's in Genesis 15, I think Genesis 14, 13 as well, that we are very well aware that Sarah is struggling with infertility. But by the time we get to chapter 16, we know that Sarah was aware of God's promise to Abraham. God's promise to Abraham that he will have descendants upon descendants and they will be successful and that God will bless them abundantly. We were well aware, like Sarah was well aware that this was coming, this was happening. God made a promise to Abraham and God had a covenant with Abraham. And literally in Genesis 15, verse 4 to 5, that's where we see this promise being made and Sarah learning about this promise that God had for Abraham. But because she was in this waiting for so long, because keep in mind, these people were hundreds of years old. they were old, guys. They were old. So she had so many years of waiting. And she grew impatient. Because it has not happened. Nothing has happened yet. And she decided to take matters into her own hands. She decided to bring in poor Hagar. Hagar was just there, minding her own business, she was just like in a different land, in a foreign land, just trying to make meat in, just trying to be a good servant and just minding her own business. And she got dragged into this mess. And because of ancient culture, it was appropriate, I guess, or it wasn't frowned upon back then for a wife to basically use a slave as a surrogate, because that is what Hagar technically was. She was a surrogate, but a married surrogate. Very weird. So in verse 1 to 2, we see that instead of waiting on God's promise, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. And this is where the nonsense starts, right? So in verse 3, verse 4 to 4, we learn that Abraham took Hagar. And this is another thing that I think I get stuck on, is just how Abraham knew of God's promises. And Abraham literally had a covenant with God. He had such a good, close relationship with God, right? And even knowing the promises that God made, and God is a God of his word. He does not change. If he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. He's going to do it. He's going to do it in the time that will be good for you, right? Not necessarily the time you think is good for you, but the time that he knows is good for you. So Abraham knowing this, Abraham being well aware of God's promises to him and his wife Sarah, he decided to take Hagar. He slept with her and she became pregnant. And as soon as Hagar became pregnant, Sarah became contemptible to her. And we see how Hagar's pregnancy changes this whole dynamic, right? Hagar is now carrying Abraham's first child. Keep that in mind. Not Sarah, the second wife. The surrogate is carrying Abraham's first child, first son. And back then it was a huge thing for if the wife gave the men a son first, that was celebrated. That was just like, oh my goodness, that is great, God bless you, all of that. So for Hagar to not only become Abraham's wife, she also became pregnant with his first son. That changed the dynamic even more. That changed God's plan. I feel like, no, let me rephrase that. God always had a plan. But because as Sarah and Abraham relied on their own strength, they played with what God would have given them, right? Because God already promised them a son. He already promised them descendants upon descendants upon descendants. And he promised them a great nation. And they were just not patient. So now Hagar is carrying Abraham's child, and she despises Sarai because, put yourself in her shoes, right? She came to this foreign land to get work and just to escape the craziness in Egypt. She finds this mistress and master, and she works as a slave. Like, she has a daily routine of whatever she was doing, and all of a sudden Sarah takes her and she becomes a wife. She becomes pregnant. She becomes another head of this household, not knowing any, like, she knew she used to be the one serving people, and now she was being served. That's a whole dynamic. That's something new. That's like a whole change in life, lifestyle. And as if that happened to me, I would also be feeling some type of way, because not only have you ruined what I had, but you forced me to do this. Because nowhere does it say that Hagar even wanted to be a mother or even wanted to do any of this. And she was just kind of pushed into it. And I think Sarah just started feeling that Hagar feels superior to her. Because then in verse 5 to 6, we learn that Sarah is saying to Abraham, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your hands, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her." Which is just even crazy that she is also, I mean, yeah, I guess it's fine if she blames Abraham too, but she, after knowing what God promised her, she put Hagar in Abraham's hand. I don't think Abraham would have gone and be like, "Hagar, I'm taking Hagar. I'm gonna impregnate her because I can't wait on God to build my descendants. I'm just gonna do it myself." Like, my man's Abraham, as much as he annoys me here, he didn't do that. Sarah initiated it. And she starts putting the blame on Abraham for his suffering, even though it was her idea. And instead of intervening here, Abraham just passes Hagar onto Sarah, like Hagar does not mean a thing. Like, he's just like, "It's your slave. Deal with her however you want. I'm stepping away." He was like, "It ain't my problem." Literally, he just said, "It ain't my problem. I did what you wanted me to do. I'm out. That's your problem. You deal with it." And Sarah mistreats Hagar so badly that she runs away into the wilderness. And this is the beauty of our God. Ugh, this is just where I feel God just continuously, like, holding us close and just showing us that He is there for us. Because in verse 7, it says, "The angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur." And 8 to 9 says, "He said, 'Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?' She replied, 'I'm running away from my mistress Sarai.' The angel of the Lord said to her, 'Go back to your mistress and submit to her authority.'" I'm just going to pause there and break down 7, 8, and 9. So in verse 7, we see that this is the first appearance of the angel of the Lord in the Bible. This is the first time an angel has appeared in the Bible. And I think this makes it so special too. This makes, I don't know, you just see that Hagar struggled with her mistress. She was thrown into the situation that she never foresaw. She did not see this coming. And when her mistress mistreated her so bad and she ran away, the angel of the Lord, for the first time in the Bible, appeared to her. And in many translations or in many stories throughout the Bible, we see that the angel of the Lord is sometimes just a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus or of God. And he stopped her because she was most likely heading back home. She was like, "I'm done. I'm outie. I don't want this. I did not sign up for this life. I am gone." But the angel of the Lord went to her and said, "Go back. Go back." And then in verse 8 to 9, God acknowledges her pain and tells her to return. And, oh man, it's like you learn these lessons. You learn from your mistakes, because as much as Hagar was thrown into the situation and she didn't want this was not part of her plan. And then once she became pregnant and once she became Abraham's wife, she got authority, right? Because now she was being served. She was not a servant anymore. And because of that, and because she was carrying Abraham's first child, she also became some type of way to Sarah, right? And when Sarah mistreated her so bad that she had to run away, God reminded her. It was like, even though Sarah mistreated her, running away was not the solution, because they were all part of the problem, right? They were all part of this. And I love that it shows that God has a plan even in the suffering. Because she was suffering. My girl was suffering. Like, she was ready to go back to her homeland. But God was like, no, go back. Running away is not the solution. And it just reminds, oh my goodness. It reminds me of so many times in my life when I was going through the most, or I not initiated, but I added fuel to whatever drama I was in. And the only solution I had back then was running away. I would just be like, I don't want to be part of this. I'm out. And it was not the solution. It made the situation so much worse than if I just stayed, if I just addressed it, if I was just patient in dealing with it. Yeah, lessons upon lessons. Okay, and then verse 10 to 12, it says, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her, you have conceived and will have a son. You will name him Ishmael. Ishmael? Sorry for the mispronunciation. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. Let's say that again. The Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will settle near all of his relatives. I'm just going to break that down. So God promises Hagar that Ishmael will have numerous descendants, much like the promise God made to Abraham. Because when God said to Abram, you will have many descendants, obviously this comes from his descendants as well, like from his first son or his sons or whatever. And you will name him Ishmael, and Ishmael means God hears, which is just so, it's like, it is such a good reminder that even in the suffering, even if you are part of the problem, which I feel like in so many cases we are, even if you're part of the problem, God still hears your prayers. God still hears your heart. And it's like a reminder of that God saw Hagar suffering, right? He saw her suffering. And like a donkey, it just says that describes Ishmael's independent and untamed nature. So even though Sarah was against all of this after everything happened, Sarah was like, kind of like, maybe I did make a mistake, right? God still said to Hagar that her son will have many descendants. And his name literally means God hears. And because God hears, Ishmael will be independent and he will have an untamed nature. Like, nobody will be able to tame him. He'll be like a wild donkey. And I think that kind of gave Hagar peace of mind. Because she literally, and this is my favorite verse. This is my favorite verse in chapter 16. So 13 to 14 says, so she named the Lord who spoke to her, you are El Roy, for she said, in this place have I actually seen the one who sees me? Hold on, let's go back. She says, you are El Roy. In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me. And the reason why I love this specific verse so much is just because it doesn't matter what you're going through. Like, if you're going through the worst darkness ever, like you've ever gone through, right? There's a moment where God steps in and he reminds you that he sees you, he is there for you. And that moment is just like, am I actually experiencing this? Am I actually seeing the God who sees me? Because we're taught that God sees us in everything that we do. Throughout the Bible, we see that God, there's so many verses where we are reminded that God sees us in every single way, part, whatever we're going through, God sees us. So for her, she's just a slave. She was a former slave. She's running away from her mistress and her husband. She's pregnant. The hormones are probably going crazy. So in that moment, when she realized that it's God speaking to her, she called him Alroy. And Alroy just means the God who sees me. And this is such a powerful message, just that God sees and cares for the outcast. Because if we look at Hagar, she was technically an outcast, right? She probably came from nothing, and she came to make a life for herself, and that's probably why Sarah decided to treat her the way she treated her. But God saw Hagar. God saw her heart. God saw her struggles, and God was there for her, which is just, it brings me so much peace, because I know that God will always see me. God was always there for me, no matter what season I'm in, no matter what wilderness I stumble in. He sees me, and he will bring me out of wherever I am. He will bring me back to him if I kind of go away, or he will just bring me back to him. Then verse 15 and 16 says, so Hagar gave birth to Abraham's son, and Abraham named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. So even though Ishmael was born, he was not the child that God promised Abraham. He was not the promise that God made to Abraham. Because God had a plan. God had a plan for Abraham and Sarah, and they intervened with it. But because God is a merciful and graceful God, he still blessed Ishmael. He still blessed Hagar. He still blessed Sarah. He still blessed Abraham, because he made a promise, and God never goes back on his promises that he makes us. Not like us. We need some help in that department. So that's basically chapter Genesis 16. We get to know Hagar. We get to know her struggles. We get to know just who she is. And this is the first time, I think the reason why I love this chapter so much, it's the first time we see an angel appear in the Bible, and she cries out, Alroy, the God who sees me. And we just learn about the consequences of not waiting on God, not being patient, or not having patience in the waiting. And we also learn that God is just a merciful and graceful God, because even though that happened, God still blessed them abundantly. God still kept his promises. Okay, let's go to Genesis 21 verse 8 to 20. And this is kind of like after Ishmael is born now, and Sarah had Isaac, and yeah, this was after that. So it says here in verse 8, the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. So this just marks his transition from being an infant, basically. Then 9 to 10 says, but Sarah saw the son mocking, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, drive out the slave with her son, for the son of the slave will not be a co-heir to my son Isaac. And yeah, every time I read how Sarah treated Hagar and his son Ishmael, I have a soft spot for Hagar. I have a soft spot for Hagar, because it's just like, my girl didn't ask for any of this. She did not ask for any of this. She just wanted to be she just came from a homeland to make a name, like to work, and then she was pushed into this, and now my girl, yeah, I just have a soft spot for Hagar. But Sarah is like, I want Hagar and Ishmael gone. I don't care that this is your firstborn. I don't want Ishmael to share Isaac's inheritance, which is kind of bad, because Ishmael is also Abraham's son. Like, Abraham did the deed. Abraham is, yeah. Anyway, let's just, anyway. So, verse 11 to 14, we see Abraham's being in distress now. And he's asking, like, he is asking for God's guidance because it's his son. He needs to send his son away. Like, he formed a bond with his son. And in verse 11 it says, "This was very distressing to Abraham because of his son. But God said to Abraham, 'Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave. Whatever Sarah says, listen to her, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. And I will also make a nation of the slave's son, because he is your offspring.'" Oh, God is so good. He's so faithful. And verse 14 says, "Early in the morning, Abraham got up, took bread and a water skin, put them on Hagar's shoulders, and sent her and the boy away." Let's break that down, shall we? So in verse 11, we see that Abraham loves Ishmael. But God also confirmed that Isaac is the chosen heir. But even though God confirmed that Isaac is the chosen heir, God also says to Abraham, "Don't be distressed about your boy and your slave. Listen to your wife, because I will also make a nation of the slave's son, because he is your offspring." And if we go back to early Genesis, we see that God makes so many promises to Abraham about blessing his offspring. And I think sometimes we are so focused, because obviously Isaac is the chosen heir. He is the chosen one. And we focus so much on him, but we also forget that Ishmael was also Abraham's offspring, and God made so many promises to Abraham and his offsprings, and God kept his promises to Ishmael, because he also becomes a great nation. And we see here that obviously Isaac is the chosen one, and God basically continues the covenant he had with Abraham through Isaac, and then the rest of Abraham's descendants, not Ishmael, no. But God keeps his promise, and Ishmael becomes a great nation. He has his own kind of nation. And then early in the morning, when Abraham got up and he gave Hagar a water skin and bread, and he basically said, "Go." He kicked her out. It was like, that's it. Goodbye. Good riddance. But shame, he did miss his child too. And he did love Ishmael as well. And this is just sad, because he gave them bread and a water skin, but that is not enough, especially if it's like Ishmael was still a child then. They didn't have much. He didn't give them much. He didn't give them any direction. He basically just said, "Go." And they went. And I think this is also like this kind of highlights their dependence on God's provision in a way, because they were exiled with minimal provisions, and they had to rely on God. And this is the sad part. This is where Genesis 21 gets a little bit sad for me, because I can only imagine how hard it is going through something like this. So, okay. So verse 15, verse 21 says, "When the water in the skin was gone, she left the boy under one of the bushes and went and sat a great distance, about a bow shot away, for she said, 'I can't bear to watch the boy die.' While she sat at a distance, she wept loudly. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What's wrong, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the boy crying from the place where he is.'" God has heard the boy cry from the place where he is. "Get up, help the boy up, and grasp his hand, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well. So she went and filled the water skin and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew. He settled in the wilderness and became an archer. He settled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. This is so beautiful. This is so beautiful. Because in 17 verse 18 it says, "Then God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, 'What is wrong, Hagar? Don't be afraid, for God has heard the boy crying from the place where he is.'" And it's a great reminder that when God makes a promise to you, he's going to keep that promise. Like, we are the promise breakers, like I said earlier. It's like because we are human and our nature is, we have a sinful nature in general, we will break promises, but God always keeps his promise because God had his eyes on Ishmael. Another reminder of God, the God who sees us, because God saw Ishmael crying. And God knew that he made a promise to Abraham, and he made a promise to Hagar that he will bless Ishmael. And Ishmael's name means God hears, and God heard him. And it's just, it just warms my heart, because even though all of this nonsense happened, God still remained faithful. God still remained faithful. He still remained faithful. Like, he showed Hagar a well, and in doing that, he showed that he will provide for them. And Ishmael grew up fine. My man became an archer, and he eventually settled in the wilderness. He had no problems. God made him a great nation. And this was just a second reminder, or a second promise of God providing to Hagar and Ishmael. And that's kind of like the learnings, I guess. That's kind of like the end of Hagar, where we see Hagar. And she is just, she reminds me a little bit about just me in some seasons of my life. And it's just a great reminder that no matter what we're going through, no matter what season we're in, that God sees us. And I wrote down a couple of things here that I really want to share with you guys, because I think it's so important. So bear with me. So for me, the key lessons from Genesis 16 and 21, verse 8 to 20, is to trust in God's timing. If you're taking notes, if you're writing things down, write this down. The key lessons from Genesis 16 and 21, verse 8 to 21, is to trust in God's timing. Like, rushing ahead of God's plan can lead to unnecessary complications and pain. God does not like seeing us in pain. I feel like our actions leads us to be in pain because we don't trust in God enough. We don't trust in his timing enough, and we are just not patient. We don't know, like, when we're in the waiting, we just don't want to be in the waiting. So this is just a great reminder to trust in God's timing. The second lesson in all of this is that God sees and cares for the outcast. Sometimes we feel unseen. Sometimes we feel like we don't feel important. We feel like if we did not exist, then life would be great, or people will just continue on going on with their lives. But God sees us, and he cares for the outcast. And Hagar's story reminds us that God never forget those who feel abandoned or rejected. In fact, I feel like he shows those a little more love, because we are all his people. And then the third lesson is pride and comparison create conflict. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I recently went through a long 31 days with Solomon, and I got to learn a lot about my pride. But that's a story for another episode. But this is just a reminder that pride and comparison can create conflict. The jealousy and rivalry between Hagar and Sarah and Ishmael led to broken relationships, because if they didn't have that jealousy, if they didn't have that pride, they could have had a great relationship. They could have, like, the sons could have grown up as brothers and together, and it could have been a great big family. But because of the pride and the comparison and the rivalry and the jealousy, that just didn't happen for them. And then lesson number 4 is God provides even in desperate situations. I'm going to say that again. God provides even in desperate situations. Just as God provided water for Hagar and Ishmael, he will provide for us in our wilderness moments. And this is something I need to remember too. Like, he will provide for us in our wilderness moments. We are not alone. Even in the wilderness, we are not alone. Lesson number 5 is God hears our cries. Like, Ishmael's name literally means God hears. And it's just a reminder that God listens when we are in distress. I mean, he listens to us on a daily basis, because I yap a lot to him, but he hears us even more when we are in distress. And then this one is also a reminder I needed to hear, I'm not gonna lie. Lesson number 6 is your past does not define you. Even though Ishmael was not the promised child, God still blessed him and gave him a future. Your past does not define you. Your past does not define you. Lesson number 7. Lesson number 7. God's promises stand even when we mess up. So even when Sarah and Abraham tried to fulfill or tried to rely on their own, even when they relied on their own strength and they tried to rush God's plan or just take matters into their own hands, God's promise still remain, because he's a faithful God. His promises remain even when we mess up. Even when we mess up, God's promises remain the same. Lesson number 8. Faith over fear. I know as Christians we say that a lot. We say, I think it's a reminder. You'll see it on printed things, faith over fear, but do we actually live it? Do we live faith over fear? Do we lead by faith or do we lead by fear? Do we live by faith or do we live by fear? Because Sarah's actions were driven by fear. But as soon as they started trusting God, he brought peace and fulfillment. So this is a lesson to live by to live by faith over fear. Choose faith over fear. Because if we have faith and trust in God, God will bring us peace and fulfillment. Now you might say, Shanae, okay, cool. How do I do this? Like, how do I even do this? And it's a great question. It is a great question. How do we take these lessons from Genesis 16 and 21 and how do we apply it to our lives? I have 9 ways for you guys. I have 9 steps of how we can do this. I hope you're still writing down because 9 ways. Ready? Here we go. Practical applications of how we can apply Genesis 16 and 21 to our lives. Number 1 is be patient and trust in God's timing. I felt that one in my soul because your girl is not known for being patient. I thought I was, but apparently I'm not. So be patient and trust in God's timing. Don't force solutions when waiting for God's promises. And this is also, I'm going to give you guys a little extra. In Proverbs 3 verse 5 to 6. Go read that. Be patient and trust in God's timing. Number 2, when you're feeling rejected, remember that God sees and loves you. Just like he saw Hagar in the wilderness, God sees you and he loves you. Go read Psalm 34 verse 18. Thank you. Number 3, be careful how you treat others. Guys, in the New Testament, we see Jesus literally say, love your neighbor, treat people how you would want to be treated, treat people how I treat you, lead with love. So be careful how you treat others. Pride and mistreatment of people can lead to broken relationships and so much more. And the scripture here that I want you guys to go read is Ephesians 4 verse 2 to 3. And we can discuss this in another time, or we can discuss this in the comments, wherever. Drop down your learnings, what you think. And number 4, pray and seek God's guidance before making decisions. This is so important. I started doing this because I am one of those people who, it's very hard for me to give up control. Like, it's very hard for me to give up control, but I've started trying to do that, and it's been such a game changer because I don't have to think about anything. I literally wake up, I'm like, Lord, whatever is your will for me today, let it be done. And I just go about my day. I don't have to think about anything. I just go and God provides. God just leads me, and it's just amazing. So pray and seek God's guidance before you make any decisions. Because if you act out of impatience or fear, that can have lasting consequences because your actions have consequences. Philippians 4 verse 6 to 7. Read that. Number 5, when you're facing trials, trust that God will provide. What you need may already be around you. Ask God to open up your eyes. Because sometimes when you're going through the most and we just tend to look ahead, like in front of us or like right here, we don't see anything else around us. And it's such a good reminder to ask the Holy Spirit to open your eyes and to walk with you, to lead you. And the scripture here that I want you guys to read is Matthew 6 verse 31 to 33. Avoid rivalry and jealousy. Instead of competing with others, trust God for your own blessings. Please read James 3 verse 16. The 7th practical application here is call out to God in difficult times. He hears even when no one else does. If you're going through good times, if you're going through difficult times, call out to God. He will hear you. And the verse that I want you to read here is with Psalm 50, verse 15. Now, this one is another good reminder for myself. Number 8 is don't let past mistakes hold you back. God's grace covers failures and brings new beginnings. I'm going to read that again. Don't let past mistakes hold you back. God's grace covers failures and brings new beginnings. And I want you guys to read Romans 8 verse 28. And the last one, it's actually so crazy because in church, our pastor literally preached this verse at church. And it's saying that trust God has a future for you. I love this so much. It's such a good reminder. Trust that God has a future for you even when life seems unfair. Just as God had a plan for Ishmael, he has one for you. And our favorite scripture as well, Jeremiah 29 verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you. Go read that. And it brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. But Genesis 16 and 21 is such a great reminder that even in our mistakes, even if in our struggles, in our suffering, that God remains faithful. Like, God remains faithful. He keeps his promises. Even in our struggles and our mistakes, he remains faithful. And also, whether we're waiting on a promise or we're feeling abandoned or we need provision, God hears and sees and provides for his people. He will never leave us alone. He's always there. He is just waiting sometimes for us to call on him. I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I know it was a lot, but it needed to be a lot. And I hope that you took some learnings from this, because there was a couple of nuggets in there. Even though I planned this, there was a couple of nuggets in there that I needed a reminder of as well. And yeah, I hope this episode touched you guys, and I hope you encountered God in a whole new way, encountered God's promises in a whole new way. And I hope you remember that he sees you. Whatever you're going through, wherever you are in your life, he sees you and he is there for you. I wish you guys a great week. See you in the next episode.